So I had some inspiration when I was working on my last rant video for a new mini-series. People in the comments asked me, how do you think X champion should be buffed or changed? And it's come to the point where simple answers can't be given. Please keep in mind that this is me just shooting ideas and it is no way truly refined, and it is more akin to shower thoughts than anything else. I thought to myself, if I was charged with thinking of ways to buff Cho'Gath, what would I suggest changing or adding to him? Currently, Cho'Gath flounders because his kit is pretty outdated. He may be one of the more efficient tanks and have some of the strongest disruption powers, but the era of burst, mobility, and murder top lanes have pushed him far from where he used to be. Keep in mind that having an outdated kit does not mean the champion cannot function. It means that the champion has not been able to keep up with the changes that have been introduced to the game. Unfortunately, Cho'Gath is such an old champion that he needs more than just a few changes, if nothing short of a rehaul of some of his mechanics. I had two ideas for Cho'Gath, one being more reasonable and the other being potentially ridiculous, but some people might enjoy the idea. Cho'Gath is a tanky disruptor who can either jungle or go and hold the top lane. As a jungle, he provides strong ganks that have become very weak with the amount of mobility shoved into the game. His sustain used to be high until it was repeatedly nerfed, but his farming potential and gold efficiency remains. In top lane, he'd split push for days and be a nearly unkillable monster, but this strength has diminished as all-in sort of top laners and power gankers were introduced. He could still become unstoppable in some matchups, but he's far easier to shut down than he was before. Cho'Gath, as already stated, has the weakness of having no mobility and having relatively difficult to hit spells. I figured that it would be okay to keep these weaknesses, but to compensate him by granting his abilities far more versatility and power. You cannot straight out make the abilities have more damage though, as a champion with too much utility and power is asking for a balanced nightmare. I instead opted to imagine abilities in which the Cho'Gath player would be given options on how the individual abilities could be used. His Rupture has always been his most hated spell. Leveling it up does nothing for it, so you can usually leave it till last to level it up. It is also difficult to hit on plenty of champions except if you silence them first, and it is also unsafe to use for poking as its cooldown can be restricting and its damage pathetic. I figured, why not add an option to trade some of its crowd control powers into ease of use and versatility? Rupture could be changed into an ability that has multiple stages and a charge system a lot like Scion. Imagine if Cho'Gath's Q could be charged, and at the very first threshold it is a circle with no knockup and lower damage, but its cast time is minuscule. Cho'Gath could effectively use this to poke and snipe some creeps he couldn't possibly reach. The next threshold would be able to add the slow component to the Rupture, along with it being a larger circle and a tad more damage. The final threshold could be the Rupture as it is now, but with a much larger circle and of course a much longer charge time, but this time it will have a knockup and a slow. His Feral Scream doesn't have many problems, but it does become wonky the bigger you become as Cho'Gath. It is harder to hit melee champions that are on your face, and your avatar size makes the spell cone harder to judge. Either the detection and ease of this is to be improved, or perhaps allow Cho'Gath to sort of target himself and scream into the air and silence around him in a circle. It would be reasonable to cut the range of the ability and remove its damage if he were to cast it on himself, but at least this would give him a far better chance of casting it if he were mobbed by melee champions. Vorpal spikes really do not have much of a problem associated with them, but the ability can be pointless sometimes. It deals okay damage and can provide some harassment against your opponent if you push against them. That said, it is nearly worthless if you're not allowed to farm or you're allowing a teammate to farm instead. I figured that a simple passive change could suffice. What if instead he gains passive mana and health regeneration when his spikes are toggled off rather than health and mana when he kills things? This would help him with those previously mentioned situations and it wouldn't send him overboard. Of course, he should lose the ability to gain sustain when he kills things if he has them toggled off. Feast is also a very boring skill at the moment. Yeah, it does make Cho'Gath bigger, and it does have the potential to look awesome when you chomp someone for the kill. However, you are usually stuck just biting the first person in proximity because you're gonna get kited or something before you actually get to use it on the target you want to. Also, for an ultimate, it just doesn't have the huge power swing like a lot of other abilities tend to have. Imagine if Cho'Gath's ultimate also worked as an ability steroid. After Cho'Gath feasts on a minion, he gains a buff that lasts X amount of time and it increases the power of his abilities. Each stack of feast could increase the duration of his buff by 2 seconds, meaning at 6 stacks the duration would be like 12 seconds. While this may seem excessive, it should be noted that Cho'Gath's cooldowns are long enough that he will likely not be able to use an ability twice unless he used them just as he ate something and just as they came off cooldown. His abilities will gain the following traits during this buff. Rupture will now have a considerably low cast time, but will always cast as if it was charged to full. Feral Scream would gain a much wider cone and slightly more range, and a larger radius if cast on self. Vorpal Spikes now increases damage to towers depending on how many ranks you have on it. While it does seem like it adds a lot of power to Cho'Gath's kit, do not forget that it causes a few things to occur. First, he is forced to put his feast on cooldown prior to a team fight, or during it, basically making it so Cho'Gath cannot use it for damage unless he uses it to eat another player and gain the buff that way. Second, this would make the intentions of Cho'Gath and his team easily telegraphed, as it is likely Cho'Gath will want to initiate while this buff is up. And lastly, it does not fix Cho'Gath's issue of not wanting to die for fear of losing his stacks. These ideas would grant Cho'Gath so much more versatility, and it would give him much more balancing options for his kit if there ever needs to be any. It would also make him feel more like actually playing some sort of Godzilla character that smashes his way towards you. The more radical idea would be to grant Cho'Gath the ability to be played in two versions. One where he is sort of a fighter and another where he's the traditional tank. What if Cho'Gath gained movement speed and attack speed according to how many stacks out of 6 or whatever he doesn't have? He'd be like a little Zergling nipping at people. Perhaps his abilities also lose some CC effectiveness, but his feast becomes a much stronger nuke since, he's hungry. Every stack of feast basically grants you more health and CC direction, but you lose out on some flat AD AP boost, movement speed, and some absurd feast damage. If you decide to just feast on everything, then you simply become the disrupting Cho'Gath that we have now. However, if you keep him on a diet, he can actually shred other players, albeit they won't be granting him any gap closers anytime soon. He'll just be moving very fast. This idea is definitely much more sillier. This is something I thought of while tossing out ideas, and I thought it was kind of funny.